a lot of times there's this idea of like, oh, I want influencers to promote my book. And it's sort of like saying, I want reporters. Well, what does that mean? Like, who is it? Who are they speaking to? What platform? Are your readers in their space? So that's the first thing, is just finding the ones that actually make sense for your book. And that sort of goes back to everything about social media for an author. It needs to be aligned with a platform where your community, your target readers congregates and are active, and then you need to be an active part of that community.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indie Author Podcast, I talk with Leah Paulos about book promotion and how to break through the noise, including the importance of early marketing planning, crafting concise and compelling pitches, and understanding the specific needs of different recipients. Leah also delves into leveraging email lists, using AI tools for crafting pitches, building relationships with influencers, and the long-tail approach to post-publication promotion. And now, let's hear from Leah Paulos about book promotion and how to break through the noise. Hello, and welcome to the Indie Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Leah Paulos. Hey, Leah, how are you doing?
Hello, I am doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great. To give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Leah Paulos is the founder and director of publicity at Press Shop PR and Book Publicity School, and has worked at the intersection of books and media for over 25 years. Named a top PR firm by The Observer, Press Shop PR has worked on many notable books, including books by Representative John Lewis, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Neil deGrasse Tyson. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband and 2 sons. And we are going to be talking today about how authors can break through the noise when everyone's attention is maxed out. And I think this is a great topic. Just recently, I had a conversation with my buddy, Michael Aron, about a question that a listener had sent in, which was, what do I do if nothing's working? And it was largely around marketing and promotion. And I was also just listening to Orna Ross on a podcast episode from the Alliance of Independent Authors talking about how maybe more so than ever before, well, I was going to say more so than ever before, our attention is being pulled away by things like social media. But I do kind of feel like there's a bit of a backlash, and maybe we're on a bit of a downturn in terms of to what extent people are allowing themselves to be pulled away by that. But there is plenty of other distraction going on in the world. And so I just thought it would be interesting to start out, when you're working with the authors that you work with, what are you hearing from them about the challenges they're facing in terms of breaking through the noise?
So, I hear, depending on where people are with the details, they have different issues. I think with self-published or hybrid, there's a lot of feeling of overwhelm and just having no idea where to start. I think with traditional publishers, there's a sense of not knowing how much to expect, and then from the publisher, and then kind of erring on the side of thinking that there will be more and that it's going to be handled, and then publication coming and being like, well, hey, what? And then, hey, no, not that much. So, that's sort of some of the things I hear from authors. And then I also hear that people are spending a lot of time on social media or starting a Substack, and they're just not seeing results. So authors sort of run into all of those problems.
Yeah. I think indie authors in particular have that challenge of having to act both as the creative force of their business, but also the publicity force of their business and the marketing force of their business and the administrative force of their business, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that sometimes on top of all those issues that every author faces, regardless of their publishing path, there's also this, publicity and promotion is not necessarily the area of expertise or even the area of interest for indie authors. And so it's even that much more of a challenge for them.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot when people are thinking about writing a book, they're thinking about the format and the subject and all of the things that go into the actual writing. But a huge part of getting a book out there is figuring out how it's going to find its audience, how they're going to hear about it. So I always suggest that authors start thinking about it as early as they can, even if it's just to open up a document from early on. If you can do it with a couple of years, great. Just have a promotional document or spreadsheet where you're throwing ideas in. You hear a podcast with another author, write it down so that you can then, when your book comes out, you can go back to it and see, is this podcast still interviewing authors? Let me reach out to them. So You definitely need to be thinking about it and as much as possible. And I know it's hard, but thinking about it, sort of having a dual mindset. So a lot of times I think the marketing and promotion it's just a different part of your brain that's working than the writing part. And just make sure that you have a little train of thought or a tract in your brain that can also focus on how you're gonna find the audience for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine. And then that time leading up to a book's publication, there are sort of two types of information an author could be collecting. One would be those things, like you said, like, oh, here's a good podcast that accepts guests, or here's a magazine that likes talking to authors, whatever those things might be. It's like the list of platforms. And then I think there would be like the content of what you want to do from a promotional point of view. Do you have advice about people getting ahead of that? Like early on, maybe they have their list spreadsheet open, but then they also have a Word document where they're capturing something else. But do you have advice on what that something else should be?
Yeah, I do actually. And this is this is a big part of the workshops that we do at Book Publicity School. So Book Publicity School is our sister company to Press Shop, which you introduced. And that's where we share all of our sort of insights from the front lines of publicity with authors so that they can understand how to promote their own books. So one of the things that we teach that's a huge part of the work is figuring out how to position your book, how to do the messaging and the pitch. One thing I sort of like to say when I'm breaking down what a publicity or a promotional book, a campaign looks like for a book is that, there's so many differences across whatever the book is, the topic, the genre, the author's platform. All of these things factor into what a campaign looks like. But across the board, every single book campaign needs to have two elements in place. So one of them is the pitch materials. Like, what are you sending? How are you describing your book to people who haven't read it, to make them interested in it, to make them want to read it, to make them want to have you on a podcast, to make them want to write about you on their Substack, to review your book. So what is it? That messaging, the press materials, what are you sending people? And then on the other side is what we were just discussing, who are you going to send it to? You need to have both things in place. You can have the most amazing pitch in the world, and then if you're sending it to the wrong people, nothing much happens. And likewise, if you're sending a sort of boring pitch or not sending what's the right material and you're sending it to the right people, also nothing happens. So you really need to get those two components in shape. So on the pitch writing and the messaging front, there's a couple things we suggest. Well, a lot of things we suggest. We have a whole courses on this. But quickly, some tips that we do offer. For one thing, it is really important to think about how to first of all know that when you are pitching your book, when you are getting in touch with somebody about the possibility of having you at their bookstore for an event or whatever it is your ask is, what you're emailing them does not need to be an absolutely comprehensive look at your book. You don't need to get every single nuance and all of the twists and turns. You need to think about it serving one purpose, which is them thinking, oh, that sounds really interesting. Can you send me a copy? Like basically that's what you need from them. And then once they get the book, they need to like the book, then the book needs to do the work. But at this point, it's about getting somebody interested. So, if it's fiction, it doesn't need to go deep into the plot. If it's nonfiction, maybe it's about the most compelling idea. It's not about, and then furthermore in chapter 9, blah, blah, blah. It's short, it's to the point. You have to understand how it's landing in people's inboxes. And that is, it's in a crowded inbox. There's most likely the person is getting a ton of other pitches about books. So it needs to be snappy, it needs to be concise, timely. So one of the things that to keep in mind is that when you are writing about your book for this purpose, when you're pitching it, it's really important to think about how it lands with the other person. So that's one of the most important things. It's not necessarily how it feels to you at that moment. Your book is going to feel how you want it to feel. And with the reader in mind, of course. But for this particular purpose, you do want to understand how it lands. So one thing that we suggest is really talking to people that don't know about your work, about your book in different ways. when you speak to a person about the book, you are in conversation, you are sort of used to thinking about what resonates with people. And if you're talking to somebody and they seem really interested and they're nodding and their eyes are lighting up and they want to hear more, like that's a good sign that the way you're positioning it right now is resonating. So make a note of that to yourself. If you, on the other hand, have maybe there's an origin story of your novel and you think it's really interesting how you came to this work, and you kind of share it and people kind of, okay, whatever, they're just not really picking up on it. Make a note, like, okay, that's really meaningful to me. I love my origin story. Maybe that's not the thing to lead with or bring up in interviews, or in this particular case that we're talking about, to pitch to interviewers. So that's one thing, is being mindful of that. And it's sort of in line with some of the things that we teach authors in our workshops about media training for interviews, that we hear so much from the authors at Press Shop that at the end of a media campaign, they feel so good about their interview skills. They're like, okay, I got this. They wish that they could go back to the start and do the interviews at the beginning of the campaign all over again, because the thing is that as you go on talking about a specific thing, you see what makes people laugh. You see what pulls flat. And you sort of want to keep that kind of thing in mind with pitch writing as well. One of the exercises we do at Book Publicity School we call it the bar test. And it's basically, how would you describe your book in a bar? It's really loud. You're not going to go in depth. It's not going to be a big opening to a big conversation. You're just kind of chatting with somebody that's next to you and they say, what are you working on? And you tell them, what is that top line message? And when you are in that situation, you do find a way to get out of writer head and into making this interesting making this interesting to this particular person. And that's a really important thing to do when pitching.
I wanted to just explore this idea of who the recipient is. So if we're thinking mainly about people who are publishing independently, they're not pitching agents, they're not pitching editors, they're pitching readers, and then they're pitching the people that will help them reach readers, like interviewers or bloggers, or possibly people who do book reviews, like book blog reviews and things like that. So do you feel as if someone has a good feeling for a relationship with their reader, maybe they either have a really good idea of their surrogate model for a reader in their head, or they just have interactions with their readers where they can have this kind of actual interaction? Do you feel as if the other kinds of pitches that an indie author would need to prepare would be different than that? Like if they were pitching somebody to be on their podcast, would you recommend that they prepare something different than they would if they were pitching to a reader that they ran into at a bookstore?
Yeah. Well, yeah, because you always, when you're reaching out to somebody, you always want to think about what they need to know. So for a reader, it's slightly different. They want to know that it's going to be a great read and they're going to love it and these things. Whereas if you're reaching out to a journalist, they want to know that it's a good book, but they also want to know that there's something newsy about it. There's something timely, because their job is not, it's not to read a book. It is to create a great story for their own listeners. So you have to speak to that need. So likewise, if you are reaching out to an event coordinator, so they need to also know that, okay, this is going to be a good book and want to hear about it, but they also want to know, is this going to be a good event? Do you have a community of readers that are going to come out and support the book? So, you have to think about what it is that the person you need, what you want from them. For a reader, you want them to read your book. For a journalist, you want them to write a story. And it's just a slightly different way of approaching what you say, if that makes sense. And it's sort of similar to the difference between pitch material for media and the back cover copy of a book. The back cover copy is more geared towards a reader. It should be a little more evergreen. You don't want it to feel dated in 2 months. Whereas pitches, they are grounded in right now. This is why you should cover this book right now, and why it speaks to themes that are resonant in the national conversation right now, or it should be very timely. So that's another sort of difference. And one of the best ways to figure out what could work for your book is to look at what similar books have, where they've been covered. So that's always a really good way to start populating your media list, is thinking, if you have an independent book, look at some other independent books that have done well, whose success you would sort of like to emulate for your own book, and that have some similarities, and try those places. Do a deep dive into where those books have been covered, and then reach out to them for your own campaign.
Yeah. So the question of how to grow and activate your community for these efforts that you're taking in order to break through the noise. We've talked about some of them, the idea of looking where other authors that are similar to you have been successful, where they found an outlet, the things that you enjoy yourself. Are there other communities that we should be talking about that we haven't hit yet?
So it's always really important for authors to have a big list of people, an email list. So if you have some sort of Substack or you have a proper newsletter, great. Try and figure out ways to add more people to it. But even if not, every author should make sure to have a big email list where they are going to share information about their pub date, or if they're going on a book tour. Doesn't mean that you're going to start spamming your friends and family. You can send an email to them, or maybe another one once it comes out and you have a couple of reviews and then some new events lined up. That's totally standard these days. And some authors are like, I don't want to do that. It feels too self-promotional. I guarantee people have gotten a lot of these. And the thing is that with those lists, those are just the people that know you are going to be really good targets for, more likely to buy your book. And then once they buy your book, they're more likely to review it on Goodreads or Amazon. So you really want to think big when you're thinking about your email list for your pub day email or pre-order email or whenever you're going to send it. I always recommend that authors start a page in their spreadsheet. You just don't want that to be an afterthought. You want that to be part of your promotion. Think about the people that maybe you went to a writing retreat with. Maybe you went to grad school with them. Maybe they were your old neighbors. Maybe you were in a mom's group with them. Whatever it is, those people are more likely to say, oh, that's great. I had no idea you were writing a book. I'm going to order it. So definitely think about that expansively.
And the idea in the theme of how can authors break through the noise, I think that email is a perfect example, because I'm pretty brutal about unsubscribing to anything other than the things that I absolutely have to see, because it's the only way I can keep my inbox under control. And so it's both encouraging to people, if they're saying, oh, I don't know if I want to send an email out about my book because it seems so braggy. And it's encouraging that other people are doing that too. But then the danger, of course, is that you're getting lost in all those other similar kinds of emails that are going out.
Right.
Are there tips you have for specifically when you're interacting with people via email? What can people do in order to break through the noise?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that's really important is the subject line. Don't treat the subject line as an afterthought. I always see people doing that, writing these really finely crafted emails. Okay, this one's perfect. And then slapping an email subject line on. And it doesn't matter. It can be the most amazing email in the world. And if someone doesn't open it because the subject line is boring, they never read it. So you do want to really think about that subject line. The first couple words are very important, because you want people that are looking at the email on their phone, which is a lot of people, are going to see it. And in your email on the phone, you really just get the first couple words. So you don't want it something really generic like new book, : that's doesn't give you much information. So you want to try and think about using more specific words in those first couple words. And also the subject should you want to kind of think about it. And I know this word has such negative connotations, but as a sort of clickbait, not in the way that it's misleading people, but in the way it is a couple words that is designed to get people to click. That's what an email subject line is. That's the only thing. It has one purpose, and that is to get people to open the email. So, think towards headlines when you're doing it. One exercise we do at Book Publicity School is, can you imagine some headlines for a news piece about your book? Like, that's not that necessarily should be your email subject line, but sometimes that can get you thinking about, okay, how would somebody else position this in a sort of newsy way? Because when you think about headlines, that's what headlines do. Headlines get you to click on the story. So, you can think about that. The other thing that you can do is you can sort of put your own ability, because all of us have it now. We all ignore emails all day long, and we open some emails all day long. So we're all very discerning email openers these days. So you can kind of put your own skills in that regard to use by, once you have some headlines, scheduling some emails to yourself for a couple days. Forget about when it is. Just say, okay, Thursday at 10, and just forget about it. And then when it pops into your inbox Thursday at 10, you're going to see it with fresh eyes and be able to evaluate it as the excellent email evaluator that you already are. You'll be able
I really like that. Yeah, because it gets past the clickbait thing. It is the true test of, is this an email I myself would want to open?
Exactly. Yeah. And when you see it like that, you'll be able to see, you could be like, oh God, I wouldn't even open that. Then start over. Or on the other hand, if you're like, well, that actually is pretty good, let me see what that says.
Yeah, I'm definitely one of those people who's guilty of crafting the email and then just slapping the subject on it. And I do find that I like using ChatGPT, putting the email in ChatGPT, asking for some advice. And oftentimes, I don't find it's very good at it, but it is good at suggesting things that I can then act on. So there might be one word, like I find them too over the top. Like I might be missing an opportunity because maybe that's exactly what I should be doing. But for my brand, let's say it feels over the top. But there'll be like one word that ChatGPT will come up with. And I was like, oh, perfect. Like that's a word I wouldn't have come up with on my own. And I think that's a great, I know that any topic related to creativity and AI is sensitive, but I do have a feeling, I let everybody make their own decision about to what extent, if at all, they want to use it for their creative work. But I do think that authors who are not taking advantage of it for the business side of their careers are putting themselves at a disadvantage. And
definitely. I think it's great for that too. I think it's great for, and this happens a lot with authors, is that you're so used to a certain way of formulating the way you talk about your book or write about your book. It's a deep rut in your brain, and it's really hard to get out of it. So that is really useful for that. Like put that language into ChatGPT and say, hey, can you give me can you rephrase this in 3 ways?
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you even put things in like using words that have been found to be successful in encouraging people to open emails, or using words that would be effective for SEO or whatever the platform is that you're aiming for, that you can help it along that way as well.
Yeah, definitely.
One of the things that you had suggested as a topic, which I think is very interesting, is the whole idea of influencers. Like, now here's something, whole concept of influencers was not really around when I first got started. So like Book Talk, of course, is an example, but influence goes way beyond Book Talk. And so can you talk a little bit about if people want to capitalize on that community to help their promotional efforts, how would they go about that?
Yeah. So I think with influencers, you have to find people that are going to be aligned with your audience. So I think a lot of times there's this idea of like, oh, I want influencers to promote my book. And it's just sort of it's saying, I want reporters. It's like, well, what does that mean? Like, who is it? Who are they speaking to? What platform? Are your readers in their space? So that's the first thing, is just finding the ones that actually make sense for your book, I think. And that sort of goes back to everything about social media for an author. It needs to be aligned with a platform where your community, your target readers congregates and are active, and then you need to be an active part of that community to get much bang for your buck. Otherwise, it's really hard. There's always the stories of somebody going on and making this sort of viral video, and then it became a bestseller. And sure, there are stories about that, absolutely. It's the exception in the extreme. For the most part, to get a benefit out of social media, you have to put the time in and be there and work on it and iterate on what works and what doesn't work. And then so connecting with influencers just amplifies your audience. So it can be really fantastic. So You definitely you have to figure out an online strategy for yourself that makes sense.
I guess that there's also, how does one define influencers? So I think that they're influencers, like if you open People Magazine or whatever, if People Magazine is even still around, they're like the influencers with a capital I. But then I think that there's just this idea that there are people who wield influence in the world that you want to be playing in, and to establishing relationships with them that will pave the way to good things for both of you. And so a good example I can think of is that I have a friend of mine who's a very successful, traditionally published author, introduced me to a friend of hers who's also a very successful, both traditionally and indie published author. And we had a lovely brunch together because the friend was passing through the area. And then she and I kept in touch, and I had hosted her on the podcast. She had hosted me on her podcast. And then a promotional opportunity came up. She was putting together a promotion, a thriller, crime and thriller fiction promotion for 13 authors, because the deal was each month he would promote one of the other authors, and we would have this kind of like year-long cross promotion. And so she asked me if I wanted to be in it, and I said, sure. And I started looking through like everybody was putting information on there, like how big's my email list, how big's my Facebook following. And I was like, whoa, I'm really the small fish in the big pond here, because all the other authors had really huge followings. But I think that she had included me because we had this mutually beneficial relationship. And I also ended up helping her out with some of like the administrative side of this promotion, because I wanted to make sure I was pulling my weight. Maybe I wasn't bringing the huge email list, but I was bringing some other things. And so I was able to tap into people who are influencing a pool of people, their own fans, in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise. And so I think it's also just important, especially for people just starting out, to think of influencers. Think of the people that have influence, not influencers with a capital I.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think a big part of when you think of an influencer, it really is, it's just very similar to media in the following way, which is when you're trying to get media attention, you're basically trying to get in front of another entity's audience. And it's the same thing. If you're working with an influencer, you're trying to get in front of their followers and their people. It's a different format, obviously, and it's a little harder to reach them, but it can be incredibly powerful. And so, for example, when we are working at Press Shop and we're working on a big nonfiction book, there's a lot of people, it used to be on Twitter, a lot of them left now, but if somebody on Twitter was talking about this particular topic and they had a couple 100,000 followers, we sort of treated that in the same way as media almost. It was like, okay, if you get this person to tweet out to their 200,000 person feed about this book, like, amazing. That can sometimes move the needle more than standard traditional media hits. So I think where the line starts to get blurry is that it's not always so. It's things like you described, where it's like partnerships and things like that, which are just harder to define because they're all a bit more idiosyncratic. And so I think for that, it's really about, first of all, pinpointing the people that are going to be meaningful for your book and for your target readership. And then, like we were saying before, with don't pitch a podcast if you haven't heard the podcast, and you have to sort of get familiar with that person to try and figure out what they're going to respond to. Those people typically, I won't say never, but typically they're not responding to the sort of straight up pitch. It's much more about something more personal or something that moves them. So you have to be really engaged with the particular person that you're targeting to see what might work.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because I do think that a lot of people think, oh, well, the scattershot approach is going to work. I'm just going to go like every successful author in my genre on every social media platform, and that's going to help. But I think it's much, and I've had this, confirmed by many podcast guests, that it's much more, you pick the people you will really want to connect with, and then you engage with them in a meaningful way, and you engage with them in a way that emphasizes what you can do for them, not what they can do for you. Right, and so if they have a book, you're reviewing their book, or you're commenting on it, or you're sharing their posts with your audience and things like that. And then even when you get to the point of pitching them, You don't want it to be, can I come on your podcast so I can sell my book? It's, I have a book that I think your audience would benefit from. And I know you as a podcast host have a goal of providing value for your listeners. And I think I can help you do that. So it's like the end result might be the same, but the tone is very, very different. And the comfort level of receiving that pitch is very, very different.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things we talk about a lot too is that when you're reaching out, you really want to be story forward. So it's like you want to tell a story. You want to be offering a story because journalists need stories. Journalists don't need to cover your book. Journalists need to find an interesting story for their readers or their listeners. So keeping that in mind is really important. The easier you can make it for somebody to cover your book, the better. Yeah. I mean, journalists are really busy, like we all are. And if you pitch them something and then they're like, oh, it sounds kind of interesting, but you didn't tell them the pub date or about your career or whatever it is. You didn't give them the material to actually write a story, to see that there's a story there and then to start writing it. And yeah, it does make it less likely. One thing that we always suggest, and we work with our authors at Book Publicity School to do this, is including a Q&A. So writing up a Q&A and including that as part of your pitch materials, particularly if you are pitching yourself to radio or podcasts or any other type of interview show. And for that exact reason that you said, it gives people, a producer, a sense of what an interview with you can look like. It saves them the brain space of getting a pitch, say, oh, that book sounds really interesting. I wonder if we should have this author on. And then having to think, I wonder what we talk about. You tell them, you show them exactly what you can talk about and show them that this will be a really interesting conversation. These are the kinds of issues that you can discuss. And it did some work for them because another part of a producer's job is to prep the host for the interview and give them questions. And you did that for them. So you do want to think about, have that idea in mind that the easier you can make it for a journalist to have a story, the better, the more likely they're going to do it. They have a lot of material they have to bang out. Everyone needs to create a lot of content these days. Everybody's busy. So making it as easy as possible is very useful.
Yeah. One thing I've seen myself a couple of times, and I've heard other people using it, is sending the personalized video. So a couple of times I've gotten pitches for the podcast where I open it up. It takes me to a private YouTube video and it says, hi, Matty, I'm so-and-so. And I just wanted to let you know that I really like your podcast. I especially like this last episode on blah, blah, blah. And a great point that made was blah, blah, blah. And I think I can also serve your audience. And that's time consuming, but it is really attention getting.
Yeah.
You get that personalized pitch in video.
Just finding a way to stand out is just incredibly important. So, and it works differently in different ways, but you just have to understand the onslaught that you are up against. You have to find a way to get their attention. You have to follow up because even if you get their attention, then they get a notification for some app and then they flits away out of their head because everyone's attention is like, that of a fruit fly these days. So you just need to keep that in mind when you're pitching.
Yeah. So a lot of the things we talked about are things that an author could do in time leading up to their book launch. But you had also talked about the long tail of book promotion and some post-publication strategies. So what are a couple of tips you'd like to share on that front? What do you do after the launch?
Yeah. So a couple of things. So we always think of the time in the lead up to publication as this sprint. And then afterwards, it's more of a marathon. I always hate when I hear authors feeling like, oh, my book came out last month and feeling like they missed some opportunity. Yes, there are opportunities. Obviously, you do want to do things before publication as much as you can. But then the book is out in the world and that really should be it's another starting point for promoting it. So there are a lot of things you can do. I mean, one thing, first of all, is making sure to leverage any attention you've already gotten. So when some sort of media hit happens, it goes out into the world and whoever hears it, but then make it work for you and, make it on your website, put it on your social media. Maybe it's in your email signature, in your newsletter. So making sure to take advantage of all of that and really present it well as you get more material about how your book is being received, any sort of positive reception or framing. Make sure to include that as in your telling of it, as long as you like it, of course. So that's one thing. Another
And when you're saying framing, can you expand on that a little bit by what you mean by framing?
Yeah. So, I think you don't always know how how people are going to read your book. And they may very well pick up on an element or a strand of your book that you weren't sure they were, or they might write about it in really highlighting this particular through line. And it was one that maybe you weren't even putting forward in the pitch materials because you weren't thinking that was going to be the most accessible angle. So once you actually see that, you see if you get reviews that maybe everybody's picking up on this particular character, maybe you keep that in mind and put that on your website or rework your press materials to acknowledge that, you know what, this piece of my book is resonating with people. That's interesting to me. Great. Like, run with that. A huge part of book promotion, and this is true for anything. It's really true for any kind of business or any endeavors, you have to be nimble. And so you have to see what works. So once your book comes out, you actually have a lot more data on what is working for people, how you're finding your readers and who your readers are. So don't turn off at that point. Look and say, okay, I thought I had these target readers. I thought this message was the best way to position it. Is that true? Or you may be like, oh, actually, this type of reader is also reading it, and they seem to really be responding here. Let me think about reworking my pitch materials with that reader in mind. Maybe go back to doing my internet research and try and figure out how to target those. Maybe there's some radio shows or blogs or whatever that focus on that framing or that subject or theme. So that's one thing, using that new information. And then you can think about other books that are coming out in your space and see if you can kind of piggyback on them. So maybe there's another book that, in the same genre that's coming out in 3 months. Maybe you reach out to that author and say, like, hey, we have these similarities and our books have these similarities. Would you like to do a joint event? Or I'd be happy to introduce you and moderate an interview with you at an event. So that way you are getting in front of their audience and you're also providing value to them because you reached out to them, you were interested in their book. Ideally, you bring some of your own readers to that event as well. So it's mutually beneficial. But then you have the publication of that other person's book that makes it timely and new in order to have an event.
Oh, that's great. I really like that idea. I'd never thought about the idea of proposing oneself as a moderator for another author's event.
Yeah.
I've actually done that, but I never thought of it as being sort of something you could bring forward to the other person.
Yeah. And think about it if you think about your own book and somebody reaches out and sees that it's coming out and is enthusiastic and says, I'm really enjoying it. I'd love to bring this. I have a lot of questions. That's wonderful. That's a wonderful thing. That's a great note to get.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I like just in general the theme of take a look at anything you're going to send out with an eye to what you would feel like if you put yourself in that person's shoes. And is the subject line of the email compelling? Is the email to offer moderation services appealing? That's always a good tip.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. Well, Leah, thank you for taking us on what I realized was kind of a circuitous trip based on my questions of how to break through the noise. Yeah. But please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. So all of our educational and workshop materials are at bookpublicityschool.com. So that's where we have all of our workshops and a lot of the kinds of things I was talking about today. And then our full publicity campaigns are all housed at pressshoppr.com. So like Press Shop PR, 3 S's, 2 P's in a row. Always have to say that, otherwise people are but that's where you can find us. And then I'm also on LinkedIn and the other platforms, but you can navigate there from the websites.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Leah. How do you break through the noise to promote your books? I would love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a comment on YouTube. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.